All right, so we looked at one way to put sentences together, coordinating them, an independent clause, a comma, and a fanboy. The second way we're going to look at putting them together is when we make a subordinating coordination. If you look at that big old black line right down the middle, it's because we're putting together two entirely different things. Now, even though this is white here, you know this is your sheet of gold. Notice the same words are written down in lowercase letters and uppercase letters. Why? Because the way you punctuate them will vary based on whether they begin your sentence or they're in the middle of your sentence. Take any sentence you want. He had a snack, all right? Put any of these words in front of it. After he had a snack, although he had a snack, because he had a snack, in order that he had a snack, any of those no longer are a complete thought. They become a dependent thought or a dependent clause. In other words, they're not a grown-up, they're a child. Remember, every sentence has to have one grown-up, one independent clause, a group of words with a subject and verb that can stand all by itself. So in this case, we are not putting together two things that are exactly alike. We're putting together an adult and a child, one that is a grown-up that can be the sentence by itself and one that cannot stand by itself. Now, when does this happen? When you're revising, a lot of times as you're rewording and you're trying to get good transitions in, you will put these together, and when you go back to edit and proofread, you will see, oh my goodness, that's not a complete thought. I can't leave it there together. I'm either going to start the next sentence with it or it's finishing the other sentence. It's a great way to write. You just can't leave those dependent clauses by themselves. Can I put them together just with a comma? Yes. Now I can't do that with two complete thoughts. Why? Because I can only do that with a fanboy. We're not using fanboys here, but we're not putting together two complete thoughts. We're putting together a dependent thought, dependent clause, and an independent clause. After he finished his snack, comma, he was no longer hungry, period. So in other words, if I start with that dependent clause, I'm going to have a comma at the end of it. He was not hungry after he ate his snack. I don't need a comma there. Why? Think of it like a grown-up and a child. If a child goes out in the street first, you're going to grab it because you don't want that child to get run over, right? So you can think of that as starting with your dependent clause. That child goes out, the adult grabs them, they go across the street. But if the adult is crossing the street first, they're protecting the child, so they do not need a comma. Independent clause, dependent clause. Or you can think of it as the child being the little letter in the middle of the sentence, so you no longer need a comma. Let's look at some more of those. If we look at some of these examples, you'll note that I call them subordinating conjunctions. Sub means less than or below. You don't have to know what these words are. They're on the right-hand side of your sheet of gold. Now, you'll get familiar with them the more that you use them, but really all you need to know are the few that you favor. Most of my students love because, since, so that. They're great. There's no reason you can't use them in writing. But when that dependent clause tries to go first, at the end of it, you're going to have a comma, and I know that comma is in the correct place because everything after that will stand alone. Because it rained very hard, comma, we had to leave early. How do I know this is a dependent clause? Because if I took off my because, which is on the right-hand side of your sheet of gold, it rained very hard would stand by itself. So here I have a dependent clause, comma, independent clause. That child try to go out into the road, you grab the child because it can't go out without you. I cannot have a dependent clause as a sentence because I have to have a grown-up or an independent clause with it. But now let's change the sentence around. We had to leave early because it rained very hard. Well, note because is in the middle of your sentence. The grown-up is going first and the child is following behind. I have an independent clause and a dependent clause, and I do not need any punctuation. Why? Because the grown-up is coming first and we're just finishing our thought. We had to leave early because it rained very hard. Now, this sounds really easy, and if you use your sheet of gold, it actually is because it helps you. So let's review this. You use a comma after a dependent clause. So in other words, if the child goes first, if that dependent word starts your sentence, you're going to use a comma at the end of the clause, and everything after that is going to stand alone. I know that comma is in the correct place because everything else does make a complete sentence. However, if I start with the complete thought and I transition to that dependent clause, I do not need a comma. So DC, comma, I see nothing, DC. So let's look at this example and see if it needs a comma or not. Is it correct or is it incorrect? Whenever Americans get hungry, they want to eat quickly. Is it correct or is it incorrect? It is correct. Whenever Americans get hungry, comma, see, I started with that dependent word. I had my comma at the end. I know that comma is correct because everything after that stands alone. They want to eat quickly. Let's look at this one. When McDonald's opened in 1954, it started a trend that continues today. Is this correct or is it incorrect? What do you think? It is actually incorrect. And the reason it is incorrect is, if you look at the right-hand side of your sheet of gold, you see that dependent word when, right, with a capital letter? Well, that capital letter tells you I need the comma. When McDonald's opened in 1954, comma, it started a trend that still continues today. Why did I have the comma? Because I started with that dependent word. Let's try this one. Whether you're talking about pizza or hamburgers, fast food is big business, earning more than $100 billion a year. I'd like a little bit of that. I don't know about you. But do you think this is correct or incorrect? Do you see that word on the right-hand side of your sheet of gold? It's incorrect. Why? If I'm starting with that dependent word, I'm going to need the comma at the end of that dependent clause. Whether you're talking about pizza or hamburgers, fast food is big business, earning more than $100 billion a year. So in other words, if I start with that dependent word, I am going to need the comma. Fast food is appealing because it is cheap, tasty, and of course, fast. Fast is not one of our dependent words, is it? Okay? Because is. So, would I need a comma? Now, I know a lot of you are going to say, yep, I need a comma. But you do not need a comma. Why? Remember, the dependent word makes the child. If I start with the independent clause, then I do not need a comma. I have an independent clause and then a dependent clause. It's like having that grown-up go across the street first, protecting the child. Independent clause, dependent clause. If it's on that right-hand side of your sheet of gold and a little letter, then you do not need that comma. Let's try one more. While it has many advantages, fast food also presents some health hazards. Yep, you're right. It starts with a dependent word. So this is incorrect because I need a comma. I need that comma after advantages. While it has many advantages, fast food also presents some health hazards. So if we review, what we are going to see is if we use one of these dependent words, we are creating a dependent clause. We cannot have a sentence with a dependent clause by itself. We want an independent clause and a dependent clause. If that dependent word starts my sentence, I am going to have the dependent clause at the end of the clause. Because he was hungry, comma, he had a snack. If I turn it around and I put that dependent word in the middle, I don't need the comma. He had a snack because he was hungry. So, subordinating conjunctions, you don't need to worry about that term. Just know what my independent and dependent clause is, my independent and dependent clause are, and then all you have to do is choose the right punctuation mark.